Prologue. December 2018. Fate could move in strange ways. Scattered amongst the countless worlds of the universe, there lived a few individuals who shone more brightly than all others, connected by tenuous threads, and so fate was drawn to them. Inexorably, those threads were bound together, woven into fate's tapestry, and creating gatherings that wrote history. Malcolm Phelps was blissfully unaware of this, yet fate had extended its influence to touch him. He didn't know he had been touched by it. Regardless, he would play his part diligently, gathering and focusing the people who needed to be drawn together, creating such a gathering on a small island in the English Channel, the Bailiwick of Jersey. If he could have seen all those disparate threads slowly being knitted together, he would have marvelled and been lost for words. He was, however, blissfully unaware. He stomped along the corridors of his sprawling mansion as the sounds of the small army of builders working reached him. Drills, hammering, laughter, and talk of the football from the weekend. It was the sort of inane conversation he expected from such people. Small-minded, short-sighted people. The sort of people who would never achieve the things he had. One of those achievements was his house. He was rightly proud of it. 12 acres of immaculately tended garden, 14 bedrooms, 5 bathrooms, and a heated swimming pool, amongst other luxuries. Malcolm was a highly successful businessman, and he prided himself on being a hard-nosed, take-no-bullshit type of person. He knew he would often rub people up the wrong way, but quite frankly, they could go forth and multiply if they had a problem with that. He had no time to worry about people's feelings, or what their opinions were. That nonsense was for social workers and counsellors, weak-willed liberals that they all were. He knew he was right, and if they couldn't see that, that was their problem. His success in business had allowed him to become the proud owner of this place. Of course, the capriciousness of fate had stepped in along his journey occasionally. It would alter his path once more, too, resulting in an unexpected find and unexpected consequences. He scoffed as he listened to them. Let them talk about mundane, pointless activities like football. It probably helped them escape from their useless lives. Some of them broke off conversation, and he could see their eyes dart to a point a few feet behind him, where he knew Makiko would be following at a respectful distance. He could see the barely concealed hunger in their eyes as they looked at her. She was something else they would never have. He sneered. The makeover was long overdue. He had good reason, though. His various business interests had been keeping him busy, and sometimes events were also too much for him to handle. A tough admission for someone like him to make, but he had to acknowledge some of the dealings had been challenging. Makiko had proven to be very useful at these moments. It was time for a complete renovation, stripped back to the brick and redecorated to the highest standard. He'd worked hard for his money, and he wasn't worried about flaunting it. He'd make no apology for that. Malcolm had felt an immediate affinity with the house the moment he had first walked in there on his initial viewing, despite, or possibly because, of its history. The story behind it was a slightly curious one. The last permanent owner had been a brigadier back in the 1920s who had disappeared under strange circumstances. Someone with a more romantic soul might have found the story intriguing, but Malcolm had no time for that either. Since the brigadier's disappearance, the estate had stayed with the family for the next 85 years, infrequently rented out to tenants wealthy enough to afford it, but these arrangements had often ended prematurely, with vague reports of general unease in the property. Odd sounds, peculiar activities, items going missing. The sort of thing that might be considered paranormal by some. Malcolm had never experienced such things himself, but then his interest in the paranormal extended further than most people's. To realize his latest vision, he'd employed the services of a major building contractor. During that time, work had progressed well. He hadn't tolerated any of the standard bollocks builders gave their normal customers, problem after problem, which in turn was going to take longer to complete and cost more, and, to add insult to injury, we'd need to disappear mid-job to go to another job we've got on the go. He'd set his stall out early to the owner of the firm. Any bollocks, he'd told him, and I mean any bollocks. The lot of you can fuck off and I'll give my money to another firm. Mr. Phelps, he complained. My firm and men are very professional. He'd stopped him dead. Any bollocks and fuck off. Understand? He had. He continued stomping around the corridors and rooms with his flat-footed leaden gait, nodding to himself, satisfied everything was coming along nicely. That sense of satisfaction caused a rare smile to form, and he felt some sort of celebration was in order. His eyes darted to Makiko, admiring her elegant form. "Makiko!" he barked sharply. "Study! Now!" The look of resignation that flashed on her face was almost immediately replaced by an impassive mask. "As you wish, Malcolm." "Yes, I wish," he retorted sarcastically, leering unashamedly at her. They soon reached his study, the noise of the workmen abating with each step. He entered the room, leaving the door ajar, and nodded at his desk. "Bend over, you slag." Silently, she did as he instructed, positioning herself as he would expect, and then felt his rough, urgent hands fumbling at the buttons of her blouse and hitching up her skirt. His sigh of pleasure, as he entered her, was audible as he enjoyed the delights she afforded. Alan, the foreman, looked on with vague disinterest as some of the large crew he was overseeing ripped out another section of the floor-to-ceiling bookshelf that had previously been installed in Malcolm's library. He had pointed out to him that they were excellent quality and still in near-perfect condition despite their age. However, along with everything else, Malcolm insisted it all went. An unnecessary waste, he mused. "What the hell?" The exclamation from one of the men caused him to look up. "Alan, look, there's a door behind it." One of the builders pointed to a wide doorway directly behind the bookshelf they had just removed. "Maybe it got covered up during their previous renovations or work," shrugged Alan. "An old room or something. Come on, get a torch and we can see what's behind it." Alan plus a couple of the team stepped through the doorway and they crossed a short passage which ended at the top of an old iron staircase descending down into the darkness. He shone his torch down, which barely illuminated the base. "Jesus, it goes a long way down." They chatted excitedly as they descended the clanking flight, which reverberated slightly under their combined weight, wondering what they would find once they reached the bottom of the stairs, cracking morbid jokes about the prospect of unearthing remains of Malcolm's victims buried down here, before burying him under the weight of the law and terminating this bloody job. Fat chance, Alan mused sourly at the prospect. He took in their surroundings. The whole area had an unfinished feel to it. The brickwork was naked, and there was no decoration. The stairs themselves had an industrial feel, solid, and not out of place in a factory. 100 feet later, they finally reached the last step. Alan raised an eyebrow and looked back up. This was a major undertaking, far in excess of any other cellar he had encountered in his entire career. They found themselves in an antechamber, a pair of large double doors opposite them. A quick scan found the area devoid of any obvious lights, fittings, or any other furniture or structure. Peculiar. "Let's see what's in there." Alan gestured to the doors with his torch. He grabbed one of the handles and pulled. Darkness awaited them. A pool of inky darkness, barely dispelled by their torches. "Go on," urged Alan weakly. He pushed one of the men forward. "Piss off! You go!" came the shaky response. "Bloody hell, what's wrong with you?" whined Alan. "It's just dark in there." "Well, you go then," responded the unwilling builder. All three of them jostled each other for a moment, cajoling, demanding, begging with each other to go in. However, all of them had a deep-seated reluctance to step over that threshold, to enter that unyielding gloom that seemed unwilling to give up its hold on the room beyond. As they hesitated, they imagined they heard something like a hissing sound. It grew in magnitude until it was undeniable. "What the hell is that?" gasped one of the men. "Bollocks," cursed Alan, wiping the thin sheen of sweat from his brow. He couldn't explain that either. It was cool down here. Why was he sweating? "I'll tell Malcolm. He can deal with this." They hurriedly agreed that was the best course of action, slammed the door shut on the darkness and sounds, and scurried back up to the library. Alan's enthusiasm for talking to Malcolm was only marginally greater than entering the mysterious cellar. Either way, he would need to know what they had found. He quickly learned that Malcolm had last been seen heading to his study with his beautiful assistant, so he too was now heading there to update him. He could see the door of the study was open a few inches, and as he drew closer, sounds that were familiar and yet entirely unexpected in a house full of builders reached his ears. The rhythmic slap of flesh on flesh, slightly laboured breathing, grunts of pleasure, and words of filth. Whore, slag, bitch. Malcolm degrading her. His steps faltered, however. As they did, he unwittingly caught sight of Malcolm's assistant bent over his desk, Malcolm positioned behind her with his trousers around his ankles, hands on her waist, pounding away for all he was worth. Alan averted his eyes. Unfortunately, though, the vision was etched into his memory. Makiko was beautiful, Malcolm wasn't, and it was this lack of allure that was the overriding impression. Alan skulked outside uncomfortably, torn with indecision about whether he should remain, eavesdropping on their sex, or to return later. He elected to stay and wait for it to finish, until the telltale sounds of Malcolm's lusty expulsion told him it was done. "Alan, you pervert!" called out Malcolm with a derisive tone a moment later. "Stop lurking there. What do you want?" Alan cringed and knocked on the door. "Come," growled Malcolm impatiently. Alan cautiously entered the room and found Malcolm smirking at him as he was zipping his flies up and buckling his belt. Alan's eyes widened slightly as he caught sight of Makiko, who was buttoning her blouse and straightening her skirt. It was the faint pattern of bruises on her arms that caused his reaction, though, not her figure. "Enjoy the show, did you?" asked Malcolm. "I know you were outside. So what do you want?" "Sorry, Mr. Phelps." Alan hadn't earned the right to call him Malcolm yet. Doubtful he ever would. Malcolm had wondered if he'd demand that he start calling him Sir, but Makiko had gently suggested Mr. Phelps was still very respectful. She could be surprisingly soft sometimes. Malcolm sighed. "You've got that face, Alan. That whiny little face that's telling me there's a problem." He had little time for small talk and social niceties. "I've already had that discussion with Greg. I told him the lot of you can fuck—" "It's easiest if I show you, Mr. Phelps," Alan interrupted, holding his hands up placatingly. Malcolm was right in that regard. There was a problem. An ominous cellar that needed someone with balls to investigate. He looked pleadingly at him and started walking towards the old library. He threw a backward glance towards Malcolm to ensure he and Makiko were following. "We think it was either part of the original construction or added soon after." Alan was wringing his hands together as he looked at the wide doorway they'd revealed earlier. "The brickwork is quite old," he added as explanation. "It's rather Agatha Christie, actually, as the bookshelf was actually a door. It's like a secret door. There's some stairs and a cellar as well." He shuddered once more at the thought of that dank room. "That wanker estate agent," boomed Malcolm angrily. "This wasn't on the original floor plans he sent me." "Look, I'm sorry, Mr. Phelps. This is as much as a surprise to us." Give me a torch then, and I'll have a look." "Well, please be careful, Mr. Phelps." Malcolm wasn't listening. He stepped through the doorway and gestured to Makiko to follow him. They crossed the short passage and navigated the iron staircase like Alan had, which shuddered with each heavy step he took. He muttered to himself about the useless idiots he was surrounded by. As he reached the antechamber, he made similar observations that Alan had. An unfinished and barren room, which was in stark contrast to the somewhat ostentatious, if old-fashioned decor of the rest of the house. As if this room would not be receiving visitors, and if it did, those that came were uncaring about its state. And finally, also as Alan had, he grasped the heavy handle of one of the doors and pulled. As the thick portal swung open, he heard something like a hissing, shivering sound echo gently in the darkness that awaited them. A hissing of excited anticipation. He recoiled and thrust his torch in front of him in an attempt to dispel the darkness. A small pool of light was illuminated by the feeble beam. "Alan, you wanker," he cursed to himself. "Trust you to give me a crap torch." He stepped back into the antechamber and checked the torch there. The beam was strong and powerful as it had been coming down the stairs. He stepped back into the room and ahead, and once more the light dimmed to a pathetic glow. To this point, Malcolm's actions had mirrored Alan's. His reaction to the cellar, whilst initially was similar, deviated afterwards. "Do you feel it?" he asked Makiko, his voice trembling with excitement. Yes, her dark eyes seemed to glow in the low light. "How did you miss this?" he demanded. "It's been right under our noses." Malcolm didn't make mistakes. She hung her head slightly. "Sorry, Malcolm." "Let's get some proper light down here. That useless bastard Alan can make himself useful." An hour later, the highly reluctant builders had a dozen high-powered work lights set up, illuminating the cellar. It was vast, 100 feet long, close to 50 foot wide, and the ceiling was almost 30 foot high. With each passing minute, he could feel it even more keenly as the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He dismissed Alan and his men soon afterwards, who needed little encouragement to leave, their unease palpable in the charged air of the chamber. He sneered at their departing backs, spineless as well as inane, before he began investigating with Makiko. "Malcolm, there is another room." He looked over to where she was pointing. There was a small door in what would be the eastern wall, not exactly concealed, but tucked into the far corner so it wouldn't draw eyes to it. He stamped over to where she was, pushed past her, and opened the door. He looked into a small room, maybe 10 foot by 10 foot. The room was devoid of any furniture, but the wall opposite the door was dominated by a painting. It called to him, demanded he step over and look at it, and he didn't hesitate. He looked, and was briefly aware the picture was of some knights holding swords. One in particular stood out, and for a moment all he could see was that sword, as everything else fell out of focus. Just the sword, singing to him, as it must do to all who looked at it. That's what he thought. That sword sung to everyone, called them to it. He eventually tore his eyes away and looked at the inscription. Names, most meaningless, but one, Albrecht von Fechten, caught his eye. It was familiar. He'd seen that name before. Well, the surname at least. He turned to Makiko and then realized she was standing next to him. Her approach had been completely silent, or had he been that engrossed he hadn't noticed her? "The name Fechten. Where have I heard it?" "Richard Fechten. He lives on Jersey too." "Yes, I knew it." He tapped the painting triumphantly. "You're going to help me with something, Makiko?" She looked at him and appeared to be wrestling with something before she nodded. "As you wish, Malcolm." He ushered her out of the room and watched her go. As he did, he smiled again. "What an unexpected turn of good fortune." 1. Max von Fechten took his passport and smiled and thanked the immigration officer who had just granted him admittance into Jersey. He wasn't sure, but it was possible he got the slightest of smiles back in return. Or it could have just been some discomfort on the part of the officer, maybe trapped wind. Max resisted the urge to pass on his advice on the matter. Better out than in, my friend. He wasn't sure his advice, that he should be breaking wind in the small confines of the passport office, would be appreciated, so he held his silence and tucked his passport away. He made his way to customs, bypassing baggage reclaim as he travelled light, hand luggage only. As he approached customs, he spotted the usual mix of holidaying families and well-heeled, tanned retirees. Max wasn't either of those. Still in his 30s, and sadly some way off being well-heeled. He'd spent many long happy months here as a young man, though, after his brother Dickie had caught the Jersey bug and decided to settle here. Ash, Katerina, even George. Yes, they had been good times. Well, mostly good times. Other than the terrible business with George. Thinking about those events, he realised he hadn't talked to or even messaged Ash for months. God, now he thought about it, it had actually been years. Had he been so busy with his own life he hadn't bothered contacting her for that long? And he used to be so in love with her back then, after George's collapse. He was never really sure if she felt as strongly as he did, or if she just needed someone to comfort her and distract her from what had happened. He had just been grateful to be with her while it lasted. Of course, it was never destined to last. The circumstances of how their relationship started, their youth. Also, Ash was stunning. He was probably punching well over his weight when they got together. "Well, maybe not well over your weight, old boy," his confident counterpart assured him. "You scrub up pretty well from what I gather." He sighed to himself. This happened almost every time he stepped into arrivals on Jersey. The reflection on his rapidly passing youth, those happy times with Ash, Katerina and Dickie, before his business absorbed most of his time. Was this why each return trip came more slowly? More than likely. And following those self-recriminations, once he left for London, there would be the promises of not to wait so long next time. This time, make sure it happens, Max. His focus returned to customs, and as it did, he spotted an individual who also didn't fit into what he would think of as normal Jersey arrivals. Max prided himself on being able to describe items, places, scenes, and people well, but he was momentarily lost for words. Undoubtedly, this man would draw stares wherever he went. Probably a touch over 6 foot, his blonde hair was set off by his black t-shirt, and he was muscled like a competition standard bodybuilder. Not just the thickness of his musculature, but his vascularity as well, shredded like a tree emerging from a wood chipper. He looked like an athletic phenom. Max looked at his own arms. They definitely needed a bit of work, he mused. A few minutes later, he found himself sitting on one of the banks of chairs inside the airport, his bag at his feet with an overpriced cup of coffee in hand. He checked his phone, but still no messages or missed calls. As he sipped, he wondered what he was going to find once he got to Dickie's. Beyond the troubling nature of the call that Katerina was ill, there were the unspoken messages that Dickie was giving off. He seemed conflicted, troubled, excited. That was another thing Max prided himself on, his ability to read and gauge people, which seemed to grow more refined as he got older. His brother was definitely not telling him everything. Dickie had assured him Katerina was still alive and conscious, but only barely, borderline catatonic. Max had demanded that Dickie repeat that statement 3 times before he could accept it. Kat had always been a paradigm of health. Clean eating, regular exercise and yoga. He chuckled sadly. Nothing like him. Too much alcohol, too much coffee, and not enough home-cooked meals. He couldn't wrap his head around the fact that it had happened to Kat. Dickie had promised that he would send his driver to collect him. The fact that so far he was a no-show told Max that things were bad, as normally Dickie's organisation was metronomically precise. Everything always ran to clockwork. Family life, business life, everything. Although the delay suited him to an extent. He wasn't looking forward to seeing Kat. He didn't really know what he would do if it were anything serious, as he knew how much Dickie loved her. If anything happened to her, it would destroy him. As he was toying with the idea of calling Dickie to find out where his driver was, he noticed the bodybuilder again. God damn! If Max had thought he was impressive from behind, face on, he was something else. It was the sort of face that belonged on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel as part of the divine horde, as if his face had been sculpted by angelic hands. Godly looks and godly physique? He shook his head. Some people were just gifted with superior genetics. Life could be unfair. He was the sort of man who would be easy to love and easy to hate. Maybe he'd been pulled in by customs, as they had gone through at the same time, yet almost 20 minutes had passed since Max had breezed through. He sort of understood why customs might want to pull this chap over, though, just to check if he was real and not packing a load of anabolic steroids. He sauntered over with that flared arm posture that comes from having extremely well-developed latissimus dorsi and sunk down a few seats from Max before he pulled his own phone from his pocket and started tapping. Max continued staring, longer than he intended, although his face made you stare. He didn't detect any arrogance, but an open, friendly face. The man obviously felt the scrutiny he was under, and looked up and flashed Max a quick grin. It caught Max slightly off guard. "Did you get pulled by customs, mate?" English wasn't Max's first language, but he'd lived in London for most of his adult life, so he spoke it better than most natives. "Yeah." He lowered his phone. Max noted his eyes were dancing with amusement. "They thought I might be smuggling roids," he went on to explain. Max nodded thoughtfully for a while. Not sure what would give them that idea. Bodybuilder chuckled slightly. So they actually asked you if you were smuggling steroids? No, not in so many words. Have you got any peanut butter on you, sir? He affected an officious nasal tone. What? Peanut butter? Yeah. Apparently people used to hide stuff in jars of peanut butter. I get asked it all the time. Do you have any jars of peanut butter? Once more, he put on an officious voice, mimicking customs. I used to like peanut butter sandwiches, but now, stay away from the stuff. Max chuckled to himself at the slightly surreal conversation, talking about peanut butter with Man Mountain and avoiding it like it was illicit grade A narcotics. I'm Max, by the way. He didn't feel uncomfortable in the slightest introducing himself. Something about this man made him lower his guard. He felt good to the core. Nice to meet you, Max. I'm Danny. His smile beamed like a beacon, and his blue eyes sparkled brighter than Max thought was possible. Max was certainly not gay, but if he was, Danny wouldn't be a bad choice to pop his gay cherry. His phone vibrated. He looked down and saw a message from Klaus, Dickie's driver. He'd never met Klaus before, and only added his number after Dickie's call last night. Look, my lift is here, Danny, so it was good to meet you, and watch out for that peanut butter. The awkward parting line. Thanks, you too. As in, good to meet you, not the peanut butter. Max turned to walk away, and then stopped. Maybe he wasn't quite ready to say his farewells. Danny, you need to get somewhere. We can drop you off if you like. Once more that dazzling smile. Thanks, I'd appreciate that. Are you sure it won't be a problem? Max waved it away. This is Jersey. Doesn't really take long to get anywhere, does it? Either way, I appreciate it. He scooped up his suitcase, muscles bulging impressively. He followed Max as he stepped outside, who soon spotted Dickie's driver, the sign displaying Fechten. Max shook his head as he sized him up. Smart, casual dress, a nice designer polo shirt, certainly more than Max could afford. Dickie was clearly a generous employer. The thing that stood out was that he could be a body double for the Austrian oak, Arnold Schwarzenegger. What was it with Max and unfeasibly well-muscled people at the moment? Was it intended to make him feel inadequate? Tapping a keyboard and flicking through books didn't do wonders for the physique. Hello, are you Maximilian? Not only did he look like the Austrian oak, he sounded like him too. The heavy Teutonic accent sent him back to his childhood for a sentimental moment. Yes, and you're Klaus? Yes, Klaus. Good to meet you finally, Maximilian. Mr. Fechten has told me so much about you. And so sorry I'm late. He paused slightly. From Max's perspective, he looked uncomfortable. He only just told me I had to collect you. He is dealing with much at the moment. The lovely Mrs. Fechten, he explained. Max waved away the apology. Don't worry about it. How is she, though? Dickie said she was almost catatonic. Yes. Sadly, she is in hospital now. I wish her to recover very soon. For a moment, Max forgot about the hulking presence of Danny. Klaus's wondering look reminded him. Klaus, this is Danny. Lovely to meet you, Danny, said Klaus. He suddenly seemed very conscious of his appearance and flicked his hair back. The pair shook hands, and for a moment, Max was reminded of the scene from Predator when Schwarzenegger and Carl Weathers clasped hands, albeit minus the ego, as their impressive biceps bulged as they did. Klaus's next look held the unasked question, who is he, as he flicked his hair again. I said we could drop Danny off, if that's okay, Klaus. He's just arrived in Jersey. Of course, anything you like, Maximilian. I'm here to look after you. They drove in silence for a while. Max was thoughtful after hearing Klaus talk about Katerina being in hospital. Not so much what he said, but the way he said it. His expression, the concern in his voice. Danny's body language spoke to him of someone who was curious about what he and Klaus had talked about, but polite enough not to probe. Max decided to share the details with him. He had that sort of face, one that engendered the sharing of secrets. Not that it was a secret as such. Still, it was a sensitive topic. My sister-in-law has fallen ill, that's why I'm here, he explained. My brother, well, he needs the support. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope she gets better soon. Once more, silence after that. Not much more to say, really. Max was vaguely aware of the conversation going on as Klaus drove. Danny had given him the address, which he had tapped into the GPS, and followed the directions from the soothingly feminine voice. Interestingly, the location was a rectory. Possibly, that would explain Danny's good looks and physique. He had a direct hotline to the Almighty. "Mr. Fechten tells me you're a writer, Maximilian." Max smiled to himself at Klaus's insistence on calling him by his full name. "How goes it? Is it going well?" he asked. "Yes, all good," he answered. No, he thought. Not something he really wanted to share with Klaus or Danny minutes after meeting them. "Actually, guys, it's going far from well. The only reason I'm not homeless is because my brother paid my mortgage off. Oh, and his handouts stopped me from having to visit food banks, so it's not going fantastically." Klaus was nodding happily, though. It was what he wanted to hear. Nice, happy things happening to the Fechten family, other than poor Mrs. Fechten being sick. He drifted off as Klaus turned his attention to Danny, asking him how old he was, where he lived, what did he do for a living, how much did he bench. Then some stuff about supersets, giant sets, protein, amino acids. Not the sort of things Max needed to worry about. As the car slowed down, Max concentrated again. He gathered they had arrived at their destination. Klaus stepped out and opened the door for Danny first, he noted. Max let himself out whilst Klaus flapped around Danny, making sure he was okay. As he did, the door to the house opened and a ruddy-cheeked, middle-aged man stepped out, a shock of white hair sprouting from his head and sporting the robes and dog collar of a priest. "Danny, Danny, Danny," he beamed. "So good to see you." "Father Benjamin." Max watched whilst the two of them shared a close hug. Once they separated, the priest turned to look at Max and Klaus. "Danny, who are your friends?" "This is Max and Klaus. They kindly offered me a lift." Klaus smiled as broadly as Father Benjamin had when he saw Danny. "Marvellous. You'll come in for a quick cup of tea? I can't let such kindness go unrewarded." Max was about to make his excuses about needing to be somewhere. His mouth was open. He was poised to decline. "Oh yeah, that would be wonderful." Threads slowly twisting together. Klaus beat him to it. Max snapped his mouth shut and looked at Klaus, a slight frown creasing his brow. Oh well, if you can't beat them, join them, he thought. And part of him was intrigued about Danny's association with the church. Klaus's smile was easily wide enough for them both, he noted. The four of them were soon seated in comfortable chairs in Father Benjamin's living room as he boiled the kettle and carefully placed a plate of biscuits down and then arranged square coasters proudly embossed with a cross in front of each of them. It was the closest Max had been to religion for a while. The father placed a cup of tea in front of him. He preferred coffee, but tea was perfectly acceptable. "It's good to see that there are still some good folk left," started Father Benjamin. "It's a rare kindness, Max." "It's nothing, Father." "So, what brings you to Jersey?" Father Benjamin looked at him intently, whilst he mentally composed his response, eyes wide with expectancy. Threads, slowly twisting together. Ancient scrutiny, millennia old as the elements needed, slowly coalesced. "Sorry?" Max looked around, slightly bewildered. "I was just curious what business brought you to Jersey, if it isn't too personal." "Oh no, if I can't share it with a priest." Max smiled, a strained smile. "My sister-in-law is not well." "Nothing serious, I hope." He didn't wait for an answer. "I shall pray for her. What's her name?" "Katerina." He nodded and smiled a beatific smile. It looked like a practiced smile, maybe one delivered at the end of a positive, upbeat sermon. Either way, Max appreciated it. If a word to the Almighty would help Katerina, who was he to reject the divine? Danny stepped into the conversation. Maybe he thought Max was feeling uncomfortable with the topic. He wasn't. Sometimes, though, Max liked to watch and listen to the interactions between others, observe that interplay. One, he found it interesting, and two, it helped him with characterization when he was writing. "How are things, Father?" Danny asked. Father Benjamin smiled again and said the right things. "Yes, everything's fine, Danny. Thank you for asking." But his eyes told Max something else. There was something troubling the priest. His face was smiling, his eyes weren't. Max then turned his attention to Danny to see if he'd noticed the reaction. If he had, he hid it well. Max didn't notice any obvious indications he was bothered by his friend's response. It was Max's turn to jump in and save the father from further discomfort. "How did you meet?" He directed his question to Father Benjamin whilst he indicated Danny. There was a split-second pause from both of them before they answered simultaneously. "Church," said Danny. "Charity work," said Father Benjamin. Max ignored the obvious lie and smoothly continued talking about other matters, but it was clear there were secrets the two had that they didn't want to share. Understandable. He was a stranger. He slid his empty cup back onto the table and stood, the cue to Klaus it was time to go, who didn't hide his disappointment well. "Father, Danny, thank you both for the hospitality, but my brother will be wondering where we are. It's been a pleasure." The pair walked them to the door, and they stood on the threshold, Max and Klaus outside, Benjamin and Danny inside. "Max, good to meet you, and thanks for the lift. Let me know if your sister is okay." He didn't bother correcting him, sister-in-law. He was grateful for the sentiment. Klaus veritably clapped his excitement. "Oh yeah, Maximilian, you must take his number. Call him. Let him know how Mrs. Fecton is getting on." It was apparent to Max why Klaus was so keen to continue the association with Danny. He wondered if Danny was aware too. Or maybe he was oblivious or immune to passing infatuations. Of course, he smiled at Klaus and then exchanged numbers with Danny with a promise to update him on Katerina's progress. Danny and Father Benjamin watched the car disappear, accompanied by the smooth growl of its engine. The priest closed the door and led Danny back inside. He sat down with a heavy sigh. "Danny, I haven't been entirely honest with you." "Oh?" "When you asked me if things were okay, they're not. Do you recall me telling you about one of my friends, Ed Hornigold? Obviously not one of the flock, but he's been a good friend over the years." Danny waited for him to continue. "Well, it seems he's gone missing. I don't know. Something about it just doesn't sit right." "What do you mean, seems he's gone missing? How long are we talking?" "A few days." "So what makes you think he's missing and not just—" "On holiday, or some sort of bender," interrupted Father Benjamin. "Well, yeah. He's a doctor, right, if I recall?" "Correct, but I don't think it's work-related either. Let me explain, Danny. We spoke about a week ago. He seemed distracted, like something had happened, and when I asked him if something was wrong, he didn't flat out deny it, but he seemed reluctant to say anything else. I don't know, he just seemed weird. Something was off. You know what I mean, don't you?" Danny nodded. He knew what the father meant. Sometimes there were little clues and hints beyond what you can see or what you were told that gave you a complete picture. Personally, that sixth sense had saved him on more than one occasion. "I know it's not much to go on, but I'd like you to look into it. Make sure he's okay. I hope you don't mind me putting this on you." Danny flashed him a dazzling smile. "Of course not." Father Benjamin looked relieved, and even managed a slight chuckle. "I'm sure it'll be nothing after all. Just an old worrier getting carried away. You know, he started seeing a new chap, Abdul, a little while back. Seems like a decent fella, but maybe they've had an argument or something, and Ed is keeping a low profile. Maybe he doesn't fancy talking to anyone." He stood and rested a hand on Danny's shoulder. "Pretty sure there's no supernatural involved this time, so nothing to worry about." 2. Klaus eased the car along the drive, the familiar sound of gravel crunching under its tyres, synonymous with his arrival at the house. Dickie was the only person he knew who had a drive which ultimately terminated in a well-tended area for the family to park cars outside the ivy-clad house. Klaus was a good improvement, though, in Max's opinion, a lot more friendly than the last driver, who Max had felt looked down at him along his impressively long nose. He didn't know why he was no longer Dickie's driver, and frankly didn't care either. Klaus had given him the abridged version of what had been happening with his family. Yes, Max knew the macro details, but when you didn't live with people and see them on a daily basis, the micro details fell by the wayside. Mrs. Fecton, sadly, not much more to say while she was ill. Eric, Max's nephew, he was a good kid in Klaus's opinion. Max agreed, he'd always gotten well with Eric, was doing well at school, and had started a friendship with a nice girl called Tara. Also, a boy called Dave Cuntley. Max could tell straight away Klaus didn't like him. "Come on, Klaus," he said. "Spit it out." "I know it's not my place to say, Maximilian, but I don't like him. Cuntley by name, Cuntley by nature. You'll see, wait till you meet him." And finally, Mr. Fechten. Traumatized by Mrs. Fechten's hospitalization, but still working so hard. "There has been no let-up in his work. He needs to delegate more. He's still working late into the night. Maybe you can speak to him, brother to brother. He will make himself sick if he carries on." Yeah, Klaus was a good egg, and he seemed to genuinely care about the family he worked for. Max opened the passenger door and stepped out. Almost at the same time, the front door swung open and Dickie and Eric emerged to greet him. Damn! Eric was taller than his father now. He was no longer a boy. He was quickly becoming a man. Surely he hadn't been away that long. "Uncle Max," he called out. Max, Dickie greeted him at the same time. He looked unchanged, mostly. Still tanned, still immaculately turned out, although there was a tiredness in his eyes that his broad smile couldn't quite hide. A slight sag to his shoulders, as if he was labouring under something heavy. "How was the flight?" "Yeah, it was fine, thanks." Good. Klaus, grab Max's stuff." He turned his attention back to Max. "You've got the attic room," he shrugged, "in case you need some privacy or some quiet time to do some writing." "Thanks, and this is all I've got." Max indicated his hand luggage. Dickie frowned. "What, you're not staying?" "Of course, I'll stay as long as I'm welcome. I just didn't bother packing much. Thought I could wear some of your stuff if needed." Dickie smiled his relief. Good. He nodded and placed a hand on Max's shoulder and led him in. "How's the writing going?" Max barked a bitter laugh. "No need to be polite, Dickie. You know how it's going. I'm still living off that money you transferred." Dickie smiled awkwardly for a moment. "I don't care, Max. It's only money. You know you just have to ask if you need any more, and I know it will come good for you." He'd been saying that for years, the part about the writing coming good. It still hadn't. Yes, Max knew he could always ask for money. Dickie had never said no once. Never made him feel bad for asking, but he felt bad for having to ask. Going cap in hand to his big brother when he was 38. Dickie had pretty much worked out when he was calling for a genuine chat and when he was calling for money. He would humour him for a bit, engage in the inane conversation Max was offering, and then say something like, "Is money a bit short?" or "Have you got to pay the service charges again?" 5 minutes after the call was ended, Max would have £30,000 or £40,000 in his account and would breathe a sigh of relief at not having to worry about money for a while, but his soul felt soiled for having to beg. Max asked the question he didn't really want to. "How is she?" Dickie looked haunted. "Not good. She fell ill a few weeks ago." "A few weeks?" Max exclaimed. "God's sakes, why didn't you call me earlier? We've got the best doctors. I didn't realise it was serious." "What's wrong with her anyway?" "No idea. Doctors don't know either. She has moments when she's better. She talks, but mostly she's asleep, muttering and twitching. It's horrible. Let me dump my stuff and then we can go and see her." Dickie nodded, his jaw set. Just under an hour later, they were in Orchard House Psychiatric Hospital, sat around her bed. Max had managed to close his mouth, literally, after his jaw dropped when he first saw her, but metaphorically, it was still hanging agape. The beautiful woman he knew as Katerina had been replaced by some doppelganger who was called Katerina and bore a passing resemblance to her, assuming the double had been nearly beaten to death with the ugly stick. She was haggard, shriveled. She looked old, horribly old beyond her years. Her hair was lank and clung to her sunken cheeks. He couldn't process how she'd only been ill for a few weeks, yet looked like this. How had she deteriorated so quickly? Dickie said she was asleep, but this looked like catatonia. Max was holding her limp hand, her skin cold, dry and papery. Once her skin had been so soft. Soft and silken, hands sensual and caressing. He hurriedly forced the thoughts away as Dickie paced up and down. "What are the doctors doing?" Max asked. "Tests, monitoring, toxicology, taking blood. I don't know. They just talk, tell me things." "Okay, who's in charge of her care?" "A chap called Julian Plummer. He's the top guy here. Eric Googled him, and apparently he's top-notch. Okay, let's talk to him. See if we can get some proper details. He didn't want to say what he was thinking. She looks bloody awful. Max was quietly insistent with the staff that they needed to see Julian Plummer, but the requests were denied. He was busy with other consultations, maybe come back tomorrow, and he might be free then. It wasn't really good enough, but Max was not one to kick up a fuss, and Dickie was too distracted to make a scene. They left. Max was reluctant to admit it to himself, but he was pleased to be out of there. He wasn't adverse to hospitals and didn't suffer from white coat syndrome or anything like that, but seeing Kat in such a shocking state was overwhelming. He needed time to process it, try to wrap his head around what was happening. It was like something was sucking the life out of her. He prayed and hoped it was reversible and the doctors could help her. The evening was subdued. Neither of them really talked about Kat. He guessed it was a case of head in the sand syndrome. Actually, they talked about everything but Kat. Work, Dickie's, which was going well. Turnover was up, orders were coming in, and the company was expanding steadily. And their sister Uta. She lived in London too, close to Max. She had recently got a promotion and was now a director of HR. Dickie was pleased for her, but Max also knew him and Dickie had the much closer relationship. Dickie had never been particularly close to Uta. There was no acrimony, it was just they weren't close, which is why Max was here and not her, witnessing Kat's decline. The following morning, they pulled up into the car park of Orchard House. "Shall we pop in and see Kat before seeing Plummer?" Dickie asked. Yes. Max hoped she hadn't slipped further overnight. She hadn't, although things had changed. She was no longer catatonic. Now she was twitching and mumbling, eyes staring yet unseeing. Incoherent mutterings too quiet for him to understand. They were urgent, though. It seemed whatever she was saying was important. He wasn't sure what was better, the twitching or the stupor. He sat down in the chair next to the bed and held her hand as he exchanged a sad look with Dickie. As he did, the twitching ceased and she looked at him, and recognition flashed across her face. "Max," she rasped. Even her voice was old. "Kat," both Max and Dickie said in unison. "It's the eyes. Can you see them? Always staring, big staring eyes, boring into me." The grip on his hand was much tighter than he expected her to be capable of. It was becoming painful. He didn't remove his hand, though. He squeezed back, hoping to lend her some strength, deal with whatever was tormenting her. "And the sounds," she said, dismay in her rasping voice. "The music is maddening. Pipes and flutes, always playing. Please, Max, please help me." "We are, Kat. You're in hospital. The doctors are trying to help you." But she was no longer listening, even if she heard anything before. She had slumped down, eyes closed, and lying still again. The twitching, mumbling and tormented Kat was definitely worse, he decided. "Come on, let's go find this Plummer fellow. We need to do something for her." Once again, though, they hit a wall. A shifting, evasive wall of excuses. Dr. Plummer wasn't in hospital today. He was called away unexpectedly. Max found his annoyance growing, but what more could they do? They returned to Dickie's house and settled down in the living room, silent and shocked. Klaus walked in soon after their return. "Mr. Fecton, Maximilian, everything okay?" "No, it's Kat," answered Dickie. "She had, I don't know, an episode." "What would you call it, Max?" "An episode." It wasn't a fit, but she seemed to be becoming delusional, seeing and hearing things that aren't there. "Oh no." His concern was obvious. "Shall I pour you two a drink?" "Yes, please, Klaus. Brandy, please." "Max?" "Yes, please, a brandy will be good." "Pour yourself one too, Klaus." "Oh, no, thank you, Mr. Fecton. I will leave you brothers to talk. You don't want me in the way." He returned with the drinks and slipped discreetly out. "Has she been like this before?" Max asked. "No, not that I've seen. That's the first. Let's not tell Eric yet. I don't want to worry him. Well, worry more. He's got exams coming up." "He'll be fine. He's inherited your brains." Max smiled wanly. "It's times like this when you wonder what it's all about." "What do you mean?" "Money, success. I've got a nice house, money, and what good is it? Kat's in hospital, wasting away, losing her mind, and the doctors are clueless or absent." Max wasn't sure how much was hope and how much was reality, but he said, "I'm sure she'll be fine. She's fit and healthy." Dickie shrugged slightly. "Yes." He looked poised to say more before sipping his drink. "You said she started feeling ill a few weeks back." Yeah. Has she started doing anything different? New diet, new vitamins, anything? No, I've gone through all these things. I can't think of anything. We'd been to a dinner party, and after that she felt a bit nauseous. I thought maybe she'd drunk too much or eaten something dodgy, maybe a bit of food poisoning. It passed, though. She was fine, and then several days after, she started going downhill. Dinner party? Whose? And what does she eat? Another businessman on the island, Malcolm Phelps. Bit of an arsehole, pompous, but it pays the network. She ate the same as me, and obviously I'm fine. We can probably eliminate that then. Dickie's phone then pinged a message notification. Max couldn't be certain, but he thought his eyes lit up ever so slightly. Who is it? He asked. Oh, work. Seriously? What's wrong with them? Tell them to sort it out themselves. Yes, I will. He seemed distracted before he tapped furiously and sent a reply. They had a couple more brandies each, and Max felt tired far earlier than he normally would. Likely a combination of Kat's condition and the brandy. He excused himself and retired. He lay down and sleep took him quickly. He became aware of gossamer fine tendrils slowly interlacing with each other, searching for the next one, growing ever thicker, merging, coalescing, till ideas became tangible. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. The process seemed to be timeless, carried out with infinite patience, waiting for the nexus to form as all disparate threads slowly twisted together. He felt eyes on him. Not the eyes Kat had ranted about, though. No, these eyes were appreciative. They had gazed on others like him. Long ago, though, hundreds of years prior. How did he know that? He shook his head. He instinctively knew it. It, she, purred in pleasure, a hint of song in that purring, singing to him, calling him. The tendrils were slowly binding to each other. Each step he took towards the sound, they grew thicker. A shadowy form swirled at the edge of his vision, slender, alluring, an ancient coupling, promises of more to come, if he was willing to take it, seize it. He lurched awake, strangely aroused by his dream, filled with desire, still hankering after a nebulous hint of a feminine spirit from his dream. He lay there, hoping sleep would take him again, and he could proceed further down the path in his dream and find out who she was, who was waiting for him. But it didn't come. Typical. Always the way when you wanted to sleep. It doesn't happen. He felt restless now, nervous energy filling his limbs. No, not nervous energy. It was worry. He was worried about Kat. It was always a horrible time to have worries playing on your mind, to wake up during the night, morning, and have those worries capering around your head, skipping and dancing so enthusiastically you couldn't sleep. Damn it. He got up. At least worrying about Kat had restored his dignity, though. He paced over to the window, which overlooked the front of the house. The lights of one of Dickie's cars winked on, and he watched as it pulled away and disappeared down the drive. He checked his phone. 0242. What the hell was he doing going out at almost 3 o'clock in the morning? Maybe he couldn't sleep either. Eventually, fatigue won out over worry, and he fell asleep again. This time, his elusive provocateur didn't make an appearance. He wandered down to the kitchen and found Klaus cooking. Ah, Maximilian, did you sleep well? A strange yearning had settled in his stomach. Yes, thanks, he lied. Wunderbar. Would you like some breakfast? I was just making some for myself. Mr. Fecton must still be in bed. Max glanced over at the pan full of scrambled eggs, which looked like it was enough for a decent-sized family. He then looked at Klaus. Yup, that makes sense. Nothing yet, thanks. Where's the coffee? No, you sit, I'll bring it. Good man, thanks. Klaus slid a tray in front of him, containing a good-sized mug, a small jug of cream, not skimmed milk, and a pot of sugar. Now, that was a proper cup of coffee, he thought appreciatively. Klaus joined him as he tucked into his mountain of food, and they talked about mundane things between chewing and drinking. Max was about halfway through his first coffee when he heard the front door open. They exchanged a puzzled look. Dickie, he called out. Yup, only me. Had he been out all night? Max went to the hall to meet him. Everything okay? Yes, Dickie answered. He was still wearing the same clothes he had on yesterday. Well, that answered his question. He had been out all night. Max waited for the explanation. "I couldn't sleep," he started. "That made two of us," thought Max. "I suspect it was for different reasons, though. So I went to see Kat. Strange visiting hours, 3 o'clock in the morning. Maybe Dickie could see he was a bit perplexed by that. Certain perks with the private medical care, he explained. That sort of made sense, Max mused. Throw enough money at an establishment, and they tended to make exceptions pretty quickly. Of course. How was she? Much the same as before, when she was quiet. Klaus has made some coffee, cream, not that bloody semi-skimmed crap. I bet you're tired. Dickie smiled. Yes, that'll be nice. Let me have a quick shower, and I'll be straight down. He walked past, and as he did, Max caught a waft of perfume off Dickie. Kat didn't have any on when they visited yesterday morning. Whose was it? He didn't want to jump to conclusions. Maybe it was a nurse or doctor who was a bit touchy-feely with him. Maybe. Yeah, he didn't want to jump to conclusions, but what the bloody hell was going on? 3. Father Benjamin MacDonald was a familiar face at Orchard House Psychiatric Hospital, having ministered to the patients and staff there. Danny couldn't help thinking he was a lot more than a simple priest. He was a rock star. From the moment they squeezed out of his Fiat 127, people swarmed him, patting his shoulder, pumping his hand, and hugging him, while the old priest smiled and chatted with them. His fans fell away by the time they entered the building, and Susan Harris flashed him a smile and gave him a hug when he and Danny rocked up to reception. As the old priest had hoped, she couldn't take her eyes off Danny, mesmerized like a damsel staring into the entrancing eyes of Count Dracula. He spent a couple of minutes making small talk with her while she leaned on her chin, nodding and rumbling in agreement as she stared at Danny. He then muttered something about having left his mobile in Edward Hornigold's office and would it be okay if he went and collected it. Susan nodded and handed him the keys without taking her eyes from Danny. Father Benjamin shot Danny a wink, while the latter gave him the look an abandoned puppy gives its former owners who have dumped it and are walking away, waving goodbye. Edward Hornigold's office was a lovely dark wood affair with a huge Persian rug, mahogany desk in one corner, and shelves lined with books on history, the occult, detective fiction, and all the subcategories of psychology. In another corner of the room were leather sofas and a couch huddled around a low coffee table. The room smelled of Old Spice, wood and leather, and Father Benjamin MacDonald took a moment to breathe it in as he looked around before he started searching the desk. Some of the drawers were locked, and for a moment he was tempted to force them open, but decided against crossing that line for now. As the desk yielded no clues, he left it and searched the bookshelves, settee and sofas. Again, nothing. He even felt down the backs and sides of the furniture, but there was nothing, not even a few meagre coins. He stood in the centre of the room and sighed, his face twisted in frustration as he scratched the back of his neck. "Where are you, Ed? What's happened to you? Did anything happen here?" A mundane search had yielded nothing, so Father Benjamin was going to have to try other means to locate Edward. He whipped out his mobile and tapped out a message. Back at reception, Danny felt his mobile vibrate in his pocket. He ignored it and continued to feign interest for a few moments in Susan's commentary on her various travels around the world. Yes, she had visited Egypt, but she had also spent time in Japan and China, even spending a couple of months on Okinawa. Their chunburu was the best. "Sorry, Sue," Danny interrupted with a smile. "I think I should look in on Father Benjamin. Maybe he needs my help." "Sure, yeah, of course." Sue smiled, while expertly masking the urge to burst into tears. Men were such heartless bar stewards. She watched Danny walk away, sighing at the play of the muscles in his legs and arms, and the fine shape of his shoulders, back and hips, and his arse, especially his arse. She turned as another figure sauntered up to the desk. "Hello, Mike," she smiled, all thoughts of Danny Shemham-Forash chased away by yet another hunk visiting her today. John Villaire frowned at the police car parked near the main entrance as he pulled into Orchard House's car park. The police were a rare sight at the hospital, which meant their presence had to be linked to Edward Hornigold. "Mike," John smiled at the familiar figure standing at the reception desk, chatting to Susan Harris. If he hadn't been wearing the uniform and stab-proof vest, he could be a tourist checking into a plush hotel, as Orchard House's reception area had polished wooden floors and mock Persian rugs. There were dark wood bookshelves everywhere, with leather sofas and armchairs around low wooden coffee tables. The air was thick with the smell of air freshener, clean carpet and coffee, and the admin staff, Susan certainly, dressed to impress. Mike turned and flashed him a big smile. "John." They shook hands. "Do you have any news about Ed?" John asked Mike. The police officer gently ushered John to one side, where they could converse in private. "We've checked the air and sea traffic leaving Jersey in the last few days, and there's no sign of Ed having left the island by boat or plane, officially," Mike began. "So he could have been smuggled out, voluntarily or against his will," John mused aloud. "Why would he want to sneak out of Jersey? Or why would someone kidnap him?" Mike replied. "If you know anything about Ed that could help us find him, John, now is not the time to keep it to yourself." "If I did, Mike, I'd tell you. You know I would." Mike nodded. "Ed wasn't seeing one of you lot, one of his colleagues, about any issues, was he?" John shrugged. "Not that I was aware of." "Did he have any issues? Any problems?" "Nothing he talked to me about. But you know Ed. He was a workaholic who was always deeply wrapped up in his patients' problems. Far too deeply than any psychiatrist should be. So one of them could be involved in his disappearance. Any of them happened to go missing in the last few days or have a spat with Ed? A grudge?" John shook his head. "I know we get some pretty disturbed people in here, but as far as I could tell, Ed always had a good relationship with his patients. I really don't think any of them are involved in his disappearance. The majority of them don't have the wherewithal to plan and successfully execute a kidnapping." "Understood, John. Will you give me the details of those that can?" "Sure." John proceeded to list the patients that Edward didn't get on with and who had the means to kidnap him, which Mike recorded on his mobile. When he had finished, he turned to Mike and said, "Mike, I'd like to help out on this one. Let me work with you. You know what I can do. Let me help you find Ed. Look, John, if this were any other case, I'd be happy to have you ride shotgun with me. I know you're a quality psychologist, mate, and we appreciate you helping us out when we've needed it. But I think you're too close to this to be truly objective, and that compromises your judgment. But that's one argument. But I have something an objective person doesn't: drive. Ed's a friend, a very close friend. I'll do whatever it takes to find him." Mike opened his mouth and hesitated. John uttered a silent prayer and felt a spark of energy surge within him. He smiled at Mike, who continued staring at him open-mouthed for a moment before shaking his head. "Fair enough," Mike barked to laugh. "Sometimes, John, I don't know what it is, but you have this face that just glows with kindness. My Nana Celestine would say that you've been touched by Jesus, so that godly souls can't say no to you." "Nah, I'm just a shrink that knows how to read people, mate." John winked at Mike. "Come on then." Mike turned and walked towards the stairs that led to Orchard House's upper floors. "Let's go have a look around Ed's office. You hoping to find a smoking gun?" "I should be so lucky." Edward may not have been in his office, but the room was occupied. Mike and John entered it to find two men there. One, a familiar figure wearing a Catholic priest's cassock, and the other dressed in shirt and trousers, with the body and looks of a male model, or porn star, John reflected. Although the porn star was standing near the couch and sofas, with a hand out, lost in intense concentration. He snapped out of his trance when the door opened. "Mike!" Father Benjamin gave Sergeant Mike Orr a warm hug and repeated the gesture with John. "How are you, Jonathan?" "Fine, Father, thanks. And you?" "I'd be a lot better if Ed was found," the priest said, looking between the policeman and the psychiatrist. "Hopefully in one piece," he whispered as he crossed himself. "That would explain you poking around Ed's office, Father, and with company," Mike said, staring at Danny. Danny stepped towards Mike, with his hand out. "Danny Shemham Forash." Mike shook it. "Constable Mike Orr." Danny repeated the gesture with John, who also shook his hand as both men introduced themselves. "So what were you doing when we walked in, Danny?" John asked, mimicking Danny's outstretched hand, with the palm pointed at the sofas and couch. "Saying a prayer," Danny lied. "Is that right?" The psychiatrist wasn't buying it. John and Danny stared at each other for several moments, neither flinching, a battle of wills which wasn't lost on Mike or Father Benjamin. "So," Mike declared, breaking the tension. "Danny, how do you know the good father here?" Danny opened his mouth to respond, but the priest beat him to it. Danny is a theology lecturer at Cambridge and a monk. We met at an ecclesiastical symposium in Boston in the USA a few years ago. A church symposium, huh? John raised a curious eyebrow. What was it on? He looked between Danny and Father Benjamin. The church's role in the fight against environmental disaster and ecological conservation, Danny replied. And the role of the church in a contemporary Western society that seems to be pulling away from traditional faiths, the priest added. Sounds interesting, John said. I have DVDs and books if you're interested, John, Father Benjamin said. Thanks, that'd be great. And how do you know the father? Danny looked between Mike and John. Or is Jersey so small and close-knit that everybody knows everybody? John smiled, and Mike was about to answer when Father Benjamin cut in again. Mike's one of my congregation, and both of them work here. John's a psychiatrist here, and a colleague and friend of Ed's. Danny frowned. You work here? He said to Mike. Mike nodded. I moonlight here as security for the extra Wonga. I see, fair enough. Danny smiled. And you're a monk? Mike said, flicking an incredulous look to Father Benjamin, who smiled back. Danny nodded. Mike raised his eyebrows. You really don't look like one, mate. You look like a... Supermodel, John added, or porn star. Yeah, Mike turned to John, dipping his head in agreement. Back to Ed, Mike, Father Benjamin said. Is there any news on him? Mike Orr shook his head, his face sombre. Sorry. Right then. The priest drew himself up. I suggest we all go downstairs for a coffee and put our heads together to discuss how we're going to find Ed. Mike looked like he was about to protest, but instead he planted his fists on his hips and sighed. Proper little posse we got here, haven't we? 4. When Max was in London, his days had a habit of blurring into one seamless whole. He would often leave his blinds shut and be perched in front of his laptop, light diffused through the thin layer of dust on the edges of each slat. Must clean them soon, waiting for the inspiration to seize him. Have that thunderbolt moment when he was struck by Harry Potter-esque magic that would initially whisk him away from the mundane life of London, England, to a virgin land filled with wonder and awe before he transported his reader to the same world. He would be their guide, slowly revealing the majesty of the land, dazzling lakes, glistening peaks, verdant forests. The sad reality was he would sit there, fidgeting for a while, before staring at his walls, at his dusty blinds, nothing really happening in his head, and then he would wander off and slump in front of the TV. The blinds would remain closed, as the lower light added a degree of mystique to his flat. The stark glare of the sunlight would highlight the reasonably well-piled stack of books that had overflowed from his shelves, and he wanted a more mystical ambience. He'd then watch a bit of Holmes Under the Hammer, maybe Come Dine With Me, followed by some binge viewing on Netflix. This would often fall under the category of research. What sort of research, though, he wasn't really sure. It just seemed he needed to categorize his time in some way that sounded useful and productive. Evenings would often see him drinking at the refectory in Golders Green. Sometimes solo, sometimes with one or more of the familiar faces who frequented it. The days would pass in such a fashion. The seamless blur might be broken up by either visiting Uta or her visiting him. Nice interludes to an otherwise dull cycle. Some evenings would be enlivened by female company. Several weeks back, he had been drinking there alone, lost in his own thoughts, when a hand was thrust towards him. He noticed the hand first, of course, as it was less than a foot from his face. It was immediately apparent it was the hand of a woman. Slim fingers, manicured nails. Then came the introduction that really confirmed it. Hi, I'm Lucy. Max had looked up and was pleasantly surprised by what he saw. Lucy was very pretty. Hello, Lucy. He shook her hand. I'm Max. I saw you were alone, drinking your whiskey. He nodded. Yes, whiskey on the rocks, occasionally with a Coke or maybe ginger ale. She smiled at him, slightly nervous, he thought, before glancing over her shoulder at two other women at another table. The three exchanged what Max took as encouraging smiles before she turned back to him. I thought you looked a bit lonely. Maybe you wanted some company. Lucy, you're a bloody mind reader. Yes, he smiled again, more broadly. Some company would be very nice. What are you drinking, Lucy? Her nerves soon evaporated. Alcohol was good at doing that, and his charm played no small part in it either, he liked to think. His eyes could sparkle too, maybe not as brightly as Danny's, not that he had met Danny yet, but certainly an acceptable level of sparkle. And he had some good tales to tell, despite his current seamless blur of sitting, watching TV, and then visiting the pub. As the night passed, her slender, well-manicured hand found its way into his. As he held it, he smiled to himself as he noticed the tan line where her wedding ring would normally be. He didn't judge. Maybe she needed the night off. Maybe her husband was no longer very attentive and she needed someone to appreciate her. Maybe her husband knew, had even encouraged this. Maybe he was ill and could no longer deal with the physical aspects of a marriage. So, no, he didn't judge. There were probably dozens of reasons why she may have cheated or strayed, none of which made her a bad person. Truthfully, it suited him. Lucy was beautiful and had a lovely figure. She was exquisitely turned out. Her makeup was perfect, as were her nails, and not a hair was out of place. But she lacked that indefinable quality that left him hankering for more. A gentle purring of pleasure, a siren call, singing to him, irresistible, gauzy fabrics draped around her, barely concealing her curves. He swallowed, suddenly breathing faster, feeling himself growing aroused. Bloody hell, what was wrong with him? God, Lucy lacked the qualities of his dream, waking now, crush, whoever she was, but she also lacked the indefinable qualities of real women he had met, the ones you thought about whilst you were supposed to be working, or when you had a quiet moment, they filled your thoughts. Qualities that were impossible to quantify and almost impossible to explain to others if you had to describe your perfect woman. No, some women possessed a certain magic that could entrance and captivate. Ash and Kat were women who immediately sprang to mind. He had kissed her good night once they had finished and smiled to himself again when she said she'd text him, as she hadn't even taken his number. It was fine. Hopefully, they had both got what they wanted from it. He certainly had. And she didn't seem to be faking her pleasure either, so maybe she had left his flat satisfied. Women like Lucy had come and gone throughout his adult life. Some pretty, some beautiful, and some, well, perhaps it would be kindest to say, not quite so blessed in the looks department. But all of them lacked that magic that would hold him spellbound for any length of time. Ash had it. He was confident that he was her rebound after George collapsed, or whatever happened to him, so he'd moved on. Painful at first, but he'd eventually accepted their split, and she was now just a friend. Max was still looking for that woman he could commit himself to, one who stimulated him not just physically, but mentally as well. So he wasn't entirely surprised that he had started dreaming about a woman who promised to be everything he wanted. Yes, days in London seemed to be part of one endless cycle, broken up by a brief encounter here and there. Since being on Jersey, his days felt different. It wasn't really a change he fully embraced, as he felt in parts anxious about Kat, anxious about Dickie if something terminal happened to Kat, although also in parts excited and aroused by his strange dream encounter. He felt like something was happening here. Something was brewing, building in Jersey. He was mostly excited about the possibility, but also wondered what would happen if he was dragged from his comfort zone of his London life. He was sitting in the kitchen, sipping his second coffee, when Dickie bounded in. That was the best way he could describe his approach, full of energy, bouncing from foot to foot. "I would ask you if you want the cup," Max said, indicating his own mug, "but you look full of beans already." "Yeah," he chuckled. The ants in his underwear looked very active. "A friend is popping in soon, just to see how everything is, how we're getting on." "That's nice." "Yeah," he nodded enthusiastically. Sam, the same enthusiastic nod. Max looked askance at him as Dickie busied himself around the kitchen, clearing away dirty mugs and plates. Klaus waved him away impatiently. "Nein, Mr. Fechten, you settle. I'll do it." "Of course, thanks." Klaus rolled his eyes up at Max in mock exasperation, who carried on supping his coffee, not realizing another crucial element was about to enter the fray. Sam turned up several minutes later. When Dickie had said the name of his friend was Sam, Max had expected a colleague from work, maybe. He had also expected a man, possibly part of the board. He certainly wasn't expecting the bombshell who walked into the kitchen. Max suddenly became very conscious of his appearance. He still hadn't had a shower, was wearing some baggy joggers and a comfortable t-shirt, and his hair was ruffled. He brushed himself down, yup, that would make all the difference, and stood up to greet her. As she drew closer, he was struck by how beautiful she was. Stunning. He was tongue-tied as he tried to say hello. Of course, she was all confidence, oozing composure, and didn't miss a beat. She was the female equivalent of Danny in the looks department. "You must be Max," she beamed. "Dickie's told me all about you. So nice to meet you finally." Funny, he hasn't mentioned you once, Sam, Max thought to himself. And you're not the sort of friend who slips into the background unnoticed. He shook her outstretched hand. "Nice to meet you." Surely fate hadn't interceded and delivered her already. Was Sam who he had been waiting for? He desperately tried to think of something funny or clever to say. Would you like a drink?" Dickie asked Sam. "Oh, yes, please, Dickie. Fruit juice or water?" Yes, it wouldn't be coffee. Not with teeth that white, thought Max. Inspiration eluded him, as it often did, and the clever or funny comment didn't materialize, as Klaus passed her some orange juice. Dickie and Sam sat at the kitchen table with their drinks before them. "Max, come and join us," said Dickie. Max noticed his cheeks were flushed, and he was sliding his cup backwards and forwards. Dickie had seemed conflicted, troubled, excited on their call days ago. Was this why? "Thanks, but I need to go and have a quick shower. I didn't realize we would be having company. I'll be back down in 15 minutes or so." "Okay, see you soon." Dickie's eyes were already locked on Sam. As Max turned to leave the kitchen, in the corner of his eye, he noticed Sam reach over and smooth Dickie's hair back. He showered, troubled by what he had seen. Dickie smelling of perfume, and then a gorgeous woman turning up at the house. Had she been a friend for a while, or was she a recent association? Did Klaus know about her? If so, why hadn't he said anything during the drive here? Silly, he wouldn't mention every friend Dickie and Kat had. They had too many passing acquaintances to list. Still, Dickie seemed awfully excited. He wasn't going to jump to conclusions, but that troubled feeling didn't leave him as he dried himself and returned downstairs to find the pair in deep conversation, accompanied by laughter and chuckles. "Oh, Max," gushed Sam when she spotted him. "Come and join us." She was hard to say no to. Klaus brought him over a cup of coffee without him needing to ask, and just as he liked it, cream and 1 sugar. He'd only known Klaus a few days, but he was really warming to him. As he sat, the scent of her perfume reached him, expensive, intoxicating, and one he recognized as the one he had smelt on Dickie. He did an admirable job of keeping his expression neutral. "Terrible business with Katerina, isn't it?" She was all concern as she said it. "Dickie has been amazing, though." She turned her attention to him. "Haven't you?" Dickie smiled awkwardly, maybe a hint of embarrassment in his expression. "Oh, don't be silly, Sam. Just doing what any husband would do." "Oh, no, so much more. Any woman would kill to have you as a husband." How long had they been friends? She turned her attention to Max. "Dickie says you're a writer." "Well, it's been known." "Oh, Max." Her laughter was like a symphony, music to his ears. Even her laugh was sexy. Where the hell did Dickie meet her? She reached out and placed a hand on his leg as she carried on laughing. "You seem very modest. Dickie says your stuff is fantastic. What is it you write exactly?" He lost concentration for a moment, feeling that gentle pressure on his thigh as she leaned forward, lips parted slightly. "Please don't embarrass yourself," he thought desperately. Books. She broke into peals of laughter once more. Books! Oh, Max, stop it! Clapping like an excited seal. He tore his eyes off her as he noticed the tall form of Eric walk in. Hey, Uncle Max. Eric, how's it going? Who are your friends? He was relieved to be distracted from Sam's presence as he focused on them. He looked past Eric at a pretty girl who he assumed was Tara and an uncomfortable-looking boy following in their shadows. This is Tara and this is Dave. Ah, the infamous Dave Cuntley, thought Max. The Dave who even the unfailingly cheerful Klaus disliked. We're just going to play on the Xbox, Eric said. Nice, what are you playing? Maybe a bit of Fortnite? Not sure yet. Dave is fucking awesome. Eric, barked Dickie. Oh yeah, sorry Dad. Max and Eric shared a conspiratorial grin as he was rebuked, and he took a moment to scrutinize Dave. Yeah, he had a gamer's build. Hollow chest, underdeveloped arms, and of course, the obligatory pale skin. Is that right, Dave? You're good at Fortnite? It was meant to be a friendly opener, but Dave glared at Max with poorly concealed hostility. Better than you, Grandad. Oh, the burn, Uncle, said Eric, reeling back like he'd been rocked by a punch. Max smiled. Maybe it was meant to be funny, but there was no hint of amusement in Dave's expression, just smouldering hate, like there was some long-standing beef between them. Max's smile masked his own anger, the uncalled-for aggression from Dave. He didn't want to make a scene here, not in front of Eric and Tara, and of course, Sam. For a moment, he saw Dave tear his gaze off Max to look at Sam. Was he trying to impress her? The slope-shouldered wimp acting tough in front of her? He glanced quickly at her to gauge her reaction. For a split second, barely long enough for him to register, he thought he could see her glaring at Dave. A hard, cold stare. Maybe. It was gone in an instant. Just the perfect looks. Warm, welcoming expression, spellbinding with its perfection. Later, Max. Eric strolled off, and Dave was no longer looking at him, just shuffling along behind Eric and Tara. Nice to meet you, Uncle Max. Tara flashed him a cute smile. Ah, they're so sweet, aren't they, said Sam. Anyway, I need to be going. Things don't run themselves, do they? Sam is a businesswoman. She's going places, Dickie explained as he looked at Max. Max looked impressed. Oh, Dickie, not in your league, though, am I? Yet? She smiled sweetly. That means a lot coming from you. Dickie walked her to the front door, and Max couldn't help watching. She placed her hands on Dickie's cheeks. Remember, Dickie, anything you need, and I mean anything, you just call me. Any time of the day, it doesn't matter. I'm always here for you. Thanks, Sam. You've been such a great support. She removed her hands from his cheeks before she wrapped her arms around him and kissed him gently on one cheek. Barely a caress of those perfect lips on his cheek. No, Max wouldn't allow himself to think it. No, he wouldn't. He fought it hard. He wasn't jealous of his brother. But then it peeked through, like a little finger poking through moist tissue paper, settling into his head. By God, those perfect lips, he thought to himself. He couldn't help becoming jealous. She turned and strutted out with more poise and grace than any supermodel.